I can immediately start then, right?
So people are now starting to come on. Go ahead.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Richard Risby, and I'm chairman of the British Ukrainian Society. We're very privileged this evening to have Ilya Ponomarev as our guest speaker and participant. And I just wanted to say that whilst, of course, the world is preoccupied with a huge problem, both health and financial, of course, we must not forget what is going on in Ukraine. He himself so courageously voted against the occupation, the invasion of Crimea, and he will provide, I am sure this evening, a unique insight and understanding of the mentality that led to that invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. It'd be fascinating to hear from him what Russia's objectives were at the time and are today. And I simply point out that Russia is very busy abroad. They are very expensively engaged as well. The oil price is weak, and that's collapsed. They have huge financial resources, but they're in difficulties. But what can anybody do effectively now to resolve the problem of Ukraine and in the sense of its relationship and the occupation by Russia directly and indirectly? How should President Zelensky handle this? And of course, he's had no encouragement from Moscow. So I would simply finally make this point. We, the United Kingdom, have a particularly bad relationship with Russia, but we've given as much support as we can to Ukraine in a number of areas, and that is a very firm commitment from us. But of course, engagement by us directly or even indirectly with Russia is very difficult. But we're very active, particularly in the Black Sea region. So I very much welcome, Ilya, I welcome all of you. Thank you so much for your participation. And as far as questions and answers are concerned, to the bottom of the screen, you just ask questions. There's a button there to press. Thank you very much indeed. Ilya, over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. Thank you very much for your kind words. I don't think I deserve them because, you know, I think that the most difficult decision for me was when I originally decided to go into politics. But when I voted against the war with Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, I was just doing my job. I was protecting my constituents. I was less thinking about Ukraine or international order. I was thinking about my duties as a parliamentarian, because that was my job. And before doing this, I consulted actually with people that were living in my electoral district, and I represented Siberia, the capital of Siberia, Novosibirsk, third largest city in Russia, and we were literally gathering on the streets in crowds, and I made people vote to vote like 10 days before the D-Day in the parliament. Every day 6 to 8 meetings, and we were discussing the same issue: how should I vote for or against the annexation? And I can tell you that the usual result was split. So sometimes it was 40 to 60 in one favor, sometimes it was 60 to 40 in another, but on average it's like half and half. So that what was the general mood of Russians before the propaganda switched on. And I can tell you, when I was asking people, I was doing it without inclination towards one or another position. So I was trying to speak objectively. These are pros and these are contras. So that's why I think that I know what Russians really thought about this situation when it all started. And now we all understand how this ended. It's ended in galloping prices in the stores, in increased international isolation, in lower wages, in economic crisis, etc. etc., etc. And if this international isolation, this is something that is not very much visible for my constituents. But the fact that instead of the bridge across Ob River that was supposed to be built in Novosibirsk, we have constructed a bridge over Kerch Strait to Crimea. This is visible. So people are noting this, and that's why I am absolutely sure that at the time when we would need to return Crimea back to Ukraine, and I think that at one point of time this will happen, when we ask Russians what they think about this, I don't think it would be a unanimous vote, yes, Crimea is ours. Rather, I would say that if we would explain everything, then we would have a very serious part of the population that would say, you know, let's give Crimea back. So said that, a couple of words about the original motivations, because I think that there was a lot of illusions on that in the West, and there is a lot of misinterpretations, especially, by the way, in Ukraine. As I said, I originally had no attachment to Ukraine, despite some of my relatives who were originally from Ukraine, but I never considered to be anyhow attached to this country. Now I'm Ukrainian citizen. President Poroshenko awarded me this status a year ago, which I'm very thankful him for. And now I really feel very much linked to Ukraine and its future. So, but when I voted, it was not in place. And I think that the last thing that was on Putin's mind also was any kind of imperialistic ambitions and concerns. Obviously, they did deliver to Russians over the media in the state propaganda that, you know, if we were not annex Crimea, there would be NATO ships standing in Sebastopol, you know, blah, blah. But I tend to think, and all my sources in Kremlin say me that, confirm me that, that they pretty much understood that the annexation of Crimea and the hostilities with Ukraine would be an open invitation for NATO. So in terms of this geopolitical security for Russia, that they have achieved right the opposite thing that was publicly proclaimed. So I think that the real motivation was actually preservation of power for Mr. Putin inside Russia. Yeah, because what Russians were witnessing on the television and on social networks is another round of revolution in Ukraine, already the second one, and Kremlin still lives in the world of fears for so-called orange revolutions, which happened in Ukraine in 2004, 2005. And there is even this popular joke in Ukraine that Mr. Yanukovych is the only president in human history that was ousted by the same revolution twice. And that's exactly what Putin fears, because he put his bet on Mr. Yanukovych in 2004. He ignited the revolution. Yanukovych failed. Then he put another bet on the same bloody Yanukovych in 2014. Again, the revolution has started, and again, Yanukovych failed. And what's the take on this in Russian elites and in Russian society? They tend to say that Akela has missed, as in popular Kipling books, book one once was said. So that means that this is not a decent leader. So he needed to make some bold move, which would overshadow this bitter defeat. And that's exactly what he has done with the Crimea. That was the message. Firstly, that the revolution is always meaning bloodshed, and that revolution leads to territorial disintegration of the country. That's the message that Putin repeats to Russians all the time since the year 2000. And so with the Ukraine, which is obviously very closely connected to Russia, he basically shows them the example, teaches them the lesson. So you see how that happened in Ukraine. Revolution is no good, and revolutionaries are not good either. And also he totally changed the public agenda inside Russia, and instead of dramatic loss in the popular support that he would likely experience if Maidan would go through smoothly, he experienced obviously the spike in popularity because of all those patriotic feelings which are so easy to ignite. So that was the right psychological tactical move, but very bad strategic decision, obviously, because that resulted in a lot of problems for the country. Talking about Donbas, I think that it was a different story, and I don't think that Donbas has started because of Putin's own ambitions. I think it was, and again, that's all my sources and my contacts in Russia back home in the ruling circles are telling me that it was basically a power game within Kremlin. Because the guy who was responsible for annexation of Crimea politically was Mr. Surkov, who was taken very hostile by his peers in Kremlin, and especially hostile relations he had with Sergei Ivanov, at that time chief of staff for President Putin. And Ivanov decided to play his own game. And all this gang, Malafeyev, Strelkov, Borodai, and all others, which were all circled about one particular community, that's so-called newspaper Zavtra, Tomorrow, which is led by our famous nationalistic, imperialistic writer Alexander Prokhanov. This community proposed this concept of Novorossiya. And also there was Konstantin Zatulin, Sergei Glaziev, Alexander Dugin, who provided ideological justification for this concept. And Mr. Ivanov organized power and financial support for that exercise. And now we have what we have. And to my knowledge, Surkov was against it from the very beginning. And he was showing sociological polls in the eastern regions of Ukraine, which illustrated that if in Crimea the soil was fertile and the majority of people in Crimea was visibly would accept the occupation, with the exception of Crimean Tatars, they were very much apolitical. Of course, they would never volunteer for the occupation, but in case if the occupation would already happen with a military force, like it happened with this polite green man, then they would say, okay, so like we are with Russia and it's great. And also they had Sevastopol, which obviously is very pro-Russian city. I'm not speaking now about the rest of Crimea, but Sevastopol is indeed pro-Russian city. But the situation in eastern Ukraine was different. The highest popular support for pro-Russian choice was in Luhansk region, and that was around 27%. The second largest was in Donetsk region, which was 24%. And no other regions in the so-called Novorossiya demonstrated support larger than 20%. Kharkiv around 19%, Dnipro around 17, 16, Zaporizhia around 12, Kherson around 14. So these were the numbers of support. So Surkov, as a political technologist, he knew that it would fail. But the security guys, they had their own understanding, and they thought that they would push it through and they would become heroes in the eyes of Mr. Putin. And Mr. Putin probably took this as a gambling card, as something that he would trade with the West for the recognition of Crimea. So right now we would support the insurgents and then we would withdraw, but at the toll that the West would say, okay, so we forget about Crimea. That didn't work. Putin tried to play the same game later in Syria. Also, I think that the whole exercise in Syria is not about some imperialistic influence or something, but it's more to trade with the West about spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, and in particular in Ukraine, and resolve the situation with Crimea. It didn't work either for many different reasons. And so now Putin feels himself pretty much in the dead end. He can sustain the situation for a long time. Yes, the whole exercise with Eastern Ukraine is expensive, but not that expensive. Russia has a lot of financial reserves that are supported by natural resources. And even in the situation with the current drop in oil prices, these reserves would allow Russia to live without any significant revenues from oil and gas for 2 to 3 years, according to their current size. And that means that the situation is tolerable. It's not optimal, but it's tolerable. And Putin is the type of guy who is very opportunistic. So his take is that Western leaders are coming and going, that there would be a significant pressure from the business community in the West to restore at one point the relationship with Russia. And it would be even more pressure from actually common people, from workers' class in such countries like Germany and France, who have a lot of economic links with Russia. Russia is buying a lot of their products, and by losing those markets, their enterprises are significantly affected. And actually, we see that Putin tends to be right in this regard, because social democrats, leftists, and ultra-right, those who are based in their popular base with those lower classes, worker classes people, they tend to support what Russia is doing, and work as Putin's representatives in Europe. But at the same time, Russian elite is very much unhappy with the current situation. They have a lot of problems with access to capital. They have problems with travel. They have the problems with their lifestyle, which is all linked to the West. And Russian elite obviously is not Asian, it's European. They want to live in Europe. And that's why Putin experiences quite a lot of pressure from inside, not from common people, but from his direct subordinates, from even his cronies. And that presents a window of opportunity for Ukraine. I think that Putin's original plan was that he can negotiate a deal with President Zelensky before May 9th, 2020, because he was expecting foreign leaders to come and see him in Moscow on the celebration on the Victory Day. And he needed to have a kind of agreement by that time to be presented to people. And obviously now, because of COVID, it's not working. So it would be delayed, but I think that the plan is still in place. Even Putin, the Russian parliament has voted to move the celebration day of the end of World War II for another day, for the 3rd of September, to split 2nd of September and 3rd of September to allow foreign leaders to come to Moscow to have the celebration. And obviously by that time, Putin wants to have a certain agreement in place. And he removed Surkov, who is usually is a man of process and not a man of result. So to say, he replaced him with Dmitry Kazak, the guy who is known to achieve results in negotiations. And that's why I think that Putin is ready to strike a deal. And I think that Putin is ready for compromises. The question is where the boundary of this compromise for Ukraine. And that's a more difficult question, but I think I leave it for Q&As, and we'll talk more about that. Guys, would you excuse me for just 10 seconds? I would plug in my phone because I see that my power is running down. Just excuse me one very little second.
Of course.
Okay, I'm back. Good.
Right. Questions? Could we have some questions coming through? I know there are a great number of people who want to ask questions. I know that Robert Brinkley, who is our former ambassador in Kiev, indeed is wanting to ask a question. And of course, he is a great figure at Chatham House. So Robert, do fire ahead. He's there. Are you there? Not there.
Yeah, I see 3 questions so far.
Good. Well, so the first one is from Stuart MacDonald, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Stuart MacDonald is a Scottish MP and indeed was given recognition by the Ukrainian government for his support for Ukraine. So Stuart, thank you very much for being present, and we look forward to your question.
Yeah, I see the question is what impact the economic impact of the pandemic and slump in the oil prices would have on Russia's ability to maintain the war in Eastern Europe and the annexation of Crimea. As I said during my introduction, I don't think that this particular crises would seriously affect the Russian ability to finance this war. This war in the current ruble prices costs Russia around 2 billion a year to finance the war in Eastern Ukraine, and another 2 billion to finance Crimea, because obviously Crimea is losing money, and Russia is putting some funds into the infrastructure there as well, because they are totally cut off Ukraine with power and water and everything else. So that's together 4 billion US. For Russia, it's a sum which is noticeable, but by far not critical. So to my mind, the biggest pressure is coming not with the economic crisis, but with the economic crisis in the pockets and in the heads of Russian elites, in the Russian large businesses. Again, obviously, pandemic affects more smaller businesses, but even large businesses are not feeling well. And because of the sanctions, they have extremely limited access to international capital markets. And the result is that they are pressing Putin. So let's normalize the relationship. Let's restore normal economic ties. Let's restore normal economic trade so that we can survive. And that's, I think, is the biggest source of pressure for Mr. Putin at the moment.
Thank you. We've got a further question here from Philip Price. You mentioned, Ilya, that Russia's Eurocentric elite are unhappy. Are they able to put genuine, effective pressure on Putin without risking their personal safety?
The answer is yes and no. In one sense, they are putting this pressure every single day. And there are a lot of ways to communicate this, but you need to do it in the way that Putin would not assume that you are not loyal to him, that you are more loyal to the West, that you are too dependent on the West, etc., etc., etc. So that means that when you are communicating your unhappiness, you're saying, "Oh, Mr. Putin, we know the way how to raise money for Russia, and we know how to finance this and that project inside Russia. But to raise this money, we need to do this and that." And then you would express what kind of steps towards normalization you would undertake. And that's more or less what is happening all the time when you read Russian media and when you look at different sayings of people of influence. You would see a lot of signs for this, and I of course have a lot of information just talking personally to many of such people. They are coming to Davos and expressing more or less the same type of attitude, etc., etc., etc. But one more thing to say is that what I think West totally failed to do during these 6 years, it actually failed to mount additional pressure on those people. My position from the very first day was that economic sanctions, so-called sexual sanctions against Russia, they would rather consolidate common people around Mr. Putin, and that's what is happening. We are seeing this because that helps Putin to say, you know, our government is perfect, we are working hard, but it's bloody Americans, you know, who are waging the war against us, and you should unite around myself. I am the only person who can protect you in this tough circumstances, etc., etc., etc. And that's working, and that's what is working in all countries which experience sexual sanctions. They always solidify the support base around central authorities. But at the same time, when we saw personal sanctions, which were waged, for example, against Mr. Deripaska and Mr. Vekselberg, that created a panic inside the elite. That created a very deep impression on them. But that was not enough. You know, the approach of cherry picking certain people who have just limited influence on their own is not achieving the objective. I remember at the moment when I was voting against the annexation of Crimea, I had, I don't know, like several dozen of my fellow MPs which were coming to me and saying, you lucky, you would be clean and nice, you would be able to travel, we will not, you know, we will be punished, the West would not forgive us, we will be blacklisted, you know, so lucky bastards. That's what they were saying. And, you know, like month, 2 months later, when they saw that actually nothing is happening and that they are not being punished, and they still, up to this very day, all the people who voted for the war, not punished, all the people who continue to do the appropriations for this war are not punished, the member of the government who facilitating the war are not punished, and they all are telling to me, now you lost your motherland and we are fine here, and nobody is saying as a word in the West, because they are scared, they don't want to have this kind of confrontation with great mother Russia. And of course, to my mind, this Western approach is very hypocritical.
Well, we've got a sort of follow-on question in a sense, Ilya, from Mick Antonov, who is actually a member of the Welsh Assembly, so, and a Ukrainian speaker, very pleased to know. But he actually says that, in fact, given looking at economic sanctions and Putin's main commitments regarding Crimea and Donbas, and you've mentioned it as being perhaps something that he would, or certainly in the case of Donbas, might wish to explore as part of a greater package. But is anything actually going to happen in terms of the impact of economic sanctions being an effective measure whilst Putin is president?
I don't think that anything may happen in the Crimean question while Putin is president, because for him it would be a suicide. But with Donbas, I think that here actually everything is in the hands of Ukraine. Of course, Moscow has, I would say, a veto power on this, and Moscow is controlling those territories, and they would say at the end of the day what Moscow would dictate to them. But Moscow is ready to give them up. And I think that may happen every given day if they would be able to come with to a compromise with Kiev on what would be the conditions of returning those territories. And I think that there are some things which basically is hard to negotiate, where the Moscow's position would be very firm, and that obviously would be a question of amnesty, probably with the exception of several hundreds most notorious leaders of this occupation authorities that Russia can return to Russia. But for this, it's almost 100,000 people who are working in the so-called government offices of so-called DNR and LNR. And of course, you know, such a great number of people cannot be taken to Russia. So they have to be pardoned, and that would have to be a precondition for the pacification. Second thing would be so-called the special status. But I think in the defining of the special status, actually, Moscow can be pretty much flexible because they want to put a check mark, so to say, because that's what was proclaimed to all Russians in the Russian TV, that we are there to protect our brothers and sisters and to make sure that they are autonomous. But this special status doesn't mean, for example, that it has to be a special status just for Donbas. And that's why I think that the initiative by President Zelensky that we will put this decentralization clauses in the constitution, which would allow all regions to be special. I think it's a wise move, and that can satisfy, maybe with certain bells and whistles, but ultimately that I think that would satisfy people there. And the last one is the status of Russian language. Again, this is something that what Moscow was justifying its invasion with, that it would be this Ukrainian fascist which would oppress the language. And the guarantees for the language, at least for those territories, I think has to be put in place. And I don't see absolutely no harm from doing this. You know, I'm right now in US. When I'm going in New York subway, I see signs in Russian as well as in Chinese and in Korean. I can go to DMV and have my driver's license exam in Russian. And I don't see what is this big problem for Ukraine to do this. Obviously, one question is to have all the government documents in Ukrainian. Anyway, anybody is speaking Ukrainian, as well as everybody in Ukraine speaks Russian. So of course the government workers have to speak Ukrainian and communicate Ukrainian between themselves, but to provide basic services for ordinary people in Russian, if they are willing to do so, and have education on the language that they like, I don't see a big problem with that. And I think these are three main conditions. If they would be met, I think that the peace agreement is more than possible.
Robert Brinkley, I just mentioned his name because, of course, he was our ambassador here. But I have now in front of me his question, which you partially certainly answered. You talked about having world leaders, I think, on September the 3rd now. But I think what you said is that part of that package would include some sort of firm recognition de facto of the annexation of Crimea. Is that correct?
I think that basically all reputable countries in the world, they recognize that Crimea was annexed. Yeah. And I think that we definitely in no case should admit that it is part of Russia, because it is not. It's an occupied territory. But I think that world has experience in the past with the Baltic states, which were never acknowledged as integral part of the Soviet Union. They were always identified as occupied territories, but that didn't preclude from interaction with the Soviet Union. And I think that what would happen at the end of the day, that would be something similar to this situation. And I think that this situation would last while Putin is in office.
Yes.
By the way, I see the question here whether the majority of Russian population of Crimea would preclude reunification of Crimea to Ukraine. I, frankly speaking, don't think so, because again, this whole stuff with Crimea, with Donbas, it's not an ethnical or religious or any other problem like this. There are no genuine contradictions between Ukrainians and Russians, and never have been, despite what some of Ukrainian nationalists are saying. They are in absolute minority in doing so. Common people don't think that way. But many people in Crimea felt alienated. They had the most corrupt authorities you can imagine. Those authorities always, they were coming from Eastern elites, not from Western Ukrainian elites, but from Eastern Ukrainian elites. It's party of regions who was running Crimea. People were completely dissatisfied with this oligarchic order. They were completely dissatisfied with the way central Ukrainian authorities were treating this territory, because it was, of course, the sweetest lands, resorts, everything, and people felt like they are not receiving properly for what they possess. And in this situation, to seduce them was relatively easy, especially in the situation when you first conduct a military occupation. So you already shown the people the force, and then under those machine guns, they are going to the voting stations. And obviously, people at best they wouldn't see much of a difference. They would just see that the power has changed, and that's why you receive the result that we have received. Although still, of course, the numbers that were reported, they are very dubious at best. But I tend to believe that the majority of Crimeans have said, like, okay, let it be like this at that moment. But it doesn't mean that they would say the same thing in the situation when there is crisis in Russia and there is prosperous Ukraine. And that's what I'm all the time saying in all Ukrainian media channels and in private talks to Ukrainian elites, that the key for returning Crimea to Ukraine is the prosperity of the country, is economic growth, is social wellness, is the ability to show to Crimeans what they have actually lost. And in this sense, time works for Ukraine and not for Russia. The dissatisfaction with Russia would only grow. And I would expect that in years from now, there would be a serious movement beyond Crimean Tatars, which would say, let's go back.
There's an interesting question from Simon Bradley, because, of course, you've talked about the possible package that Zelensky could offer to try and get some resolution of this problem. But how is there some help that the West can give to promote this? Because it's been very difficult for all European countries, for all countries, to have a relationship that is steady, but it's always erratic and difficult with Putin. So is there some way that, given the support in the past has never been particularly successful for Ukraine in terms of Russia, that how should the West respond in helping Zelensky put forward some sort of resolution of this?
You know, the West, I think, is doing something that Western leaders think would be beneficial for the situation, is they are trying to lay as many carrots for Mr. Putin as possible for him to make a deal with Ukraine. And that's why it was President Macron talking about the returning of Russia to G8, and many politicians are talking about the relaxation of sanctions and you know, this kind of things. And I think in general that's the correct approach in this regards. Just that the message that goes in public is very unclear for the ordinary people. It's just that it's very much seen and heard, say, by Ukrainians as the West is just giving up and wants to go back to business as usual. So the part that if you, Mr. Putin, would negotiate a peace, then we will do certain relaxation on sanctions and everything. This if part is very much missing for the general audience. They hear only the second part. And hearing just the second part does not help Mr. Zelensky at all, because this very loud opposition that he has, it's a minority opposition. I would say like maximum 10% of Ukrainian population, but it's extremely loud and influential minority who is taking every single step towards peace plan as a potential traitorship. And all those sayings from the West, they are taken as a weakness of Ukrainian diplomacy, and they use every single occasion to criticize Mr. Zelensky, not to be tough enough with Mr. Putin, and even naming Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, as Putin's agent, you know, FSB spy, you know, this kind of things. And because Ukrainian society is so much disoriented at the moment, and from other side, absolutely free, a lot of democratic media, free media that are very popular and people are listening to, and you know, they all from the different angles. You know, pro-Russian forces are saying that Zelensky is no good and the traitor. Pro-Western forces are saying that Zelensky is no good and the traitor. That limits the possibility for Zelensky to negotiate significantly, and it slows down the process a lot.
We have a question here from Yuri Bender, distinguished from the Financial Times, originally Ukrainian. And I think this is a very telling question, because he says here, as you will see there, does the Ukrainian elite want Donbas to actually come back, bearing in mind that it would be very expensive, the rebuilding costs, it would lead to reintegration of a population that may not be totally in favor of the Ukrainian national project, and would it return to old smokestack activity rather than the high-tech industry, which is actually doing rather well in Ukraine?
It's a great question, but to answer it, you need to define what Ukrainian elite is. Because if we are talking about the current authorities and the current political leadership, then the answer would be absolutely definitely 100% yes. They want Crimea, Donbas, and of course Crimea, but firstly Donbas, to be reintegrated in Ukraine. No doubt they want this. If you're talking about the previous elites, which were around President Poroshenko from one side and Popular Front Party Yatsenyuk from another side. So Arseniy Yatsenyuk's people tend to this idea of let's build a wall around Donbas and forget about it for a while, and then we see what happens. That was their position. And of course the position of many of their followers, but you know, we know how much popular support they had before the previous elections. They even didn't go to ballots because they were well below 1%. with President Poroshenko's elites, they publicly were saying all the time, of course, that they want Donbas to be back, but they were staying on the position that we want Donbas back, but very firmly, without any compromises on our conditions. And let's reconquer Donbas. And obviously that's not happening. And they understood that it's not happening and that would not happen. And unfortunately, he has a lot of people, the former president has a lot of people around him who were financially benefiting from the state of war. And also it was very easy to justify whatever problems the country has in the economy with the war, which to my mind is a wrong excuse. And I am working in the investment business. I can tell you that foreign investors are not asking questions about the war. They are asking questions about the effectiveness of the government, the corruption, the predictability, and primarily the predictability of the economic policies. The question of war for them is usually like number 5, number 6 on the list of their concerns. So that excuse about the war was pretty lame. And to finish answering this question, and that also goes to the previous question, to my mind, number one, what West needs to do with Ukraine is not about pressuring Putin. You guys not very efficient on that, and I think that you would rather generate a lot of dissatisfaction among us watching us doing what you guys are doing. But economic assistance, and not just giving money as loans, but facilitating investments in Ukraine, helping Ukraine to restore industrial potential. What some of Ukrainian politicians were speaking, and that's where I second them all the time on all the conferences, a new Marshall Plan for Ukraine. So economic growth, economic prosperity, social rehabilitation of the country. People should feel that their choice that they have made in 2014 brought them everything that they actually wanted, and that they benefited from being on the European side. Right now, they don't feel that.
Can I just bring two questions together, because it deals specifically with what is going on in the Donbas, which is why Russian, it comes from Anton Chutenko, and he is saying that why Russian separatists continue violating the ceasefire agreement. This is done presumably with the permission from Putin himself. And then as far as the actual political administration of Donbass, this is a question from Stephen Del Deal. In what ways is it directly linked with Russian officials? Is this, so those are just two questions about what is actually happening on the ground in the area.
Good question. So about violations of ceasefire, sometimes it is being inspired by Moscow, and in general that's the way Putin usually negotiates. He increases the heat and then pushes through his agenda. That's his like usual approach towards negotiations. But I tend to think at this very moment, because I really think that Putin wants to negotiate, and I don't see how those violations actually pressure Zelensky at the moment. They were pressing Poroshenko a lot in the past. But at the current state of media landscape in Ukraine and the state of mind, you know, I think that this influence, fortunately or unfortunately, is lower in Ukraine. A lot of things have changed during last year after Zelensky came to power. But at the current moment, it could very much be the initiative of the separatists, because of course they have been supervised and led by Russian military and there are instructors there, there are commanders there, and everything. But at the same time, they need to keep reminding Moscow that Moscow should not forget about them, that Moscow should not abandon them, that they can literally pull the plug and kill the peace negotiations if they would start any fighting on their own. And there are a lot of guerrilla commanders who, like, theoretically are under control, but practically are not. Those are bandits, that's rogue states, and there are a lot of independent actors who have weapons, who have ammunition, and who can play their own game. And they are very much interested that after the peace is negotiated, they would not be abandoned. They don't see their future in Ukraine, and they want to have a good and comfortable place in Russia. So they also raising stakes for this. And that's coming to answering the question about the leadership of DNR and LNR. Of course, the leaders are controlled by Moscow. I would say, and I would deliberately use the word controlled, but not commanded, because it's a usual approach of Kremlin to be able to capitalize on positive events, but to distantiate from negatives. And that's why, when they have done something wrong, they will say, it's not ours, they were doing on their own. When they would do something positive, they will say, we told them to do so, and they have done it. That's the way Russian bureaucracy works all the time, and it's very valid to this case as well. And in regards to military, they have direct control because they have Russian generals and mid-level staff on the ground. They don't have a lot of regular troops on the ground. Regular troops are concentrated in Rostov region, and they can be brought in case of offensive from Ukrainian army. So they have backup forces standing by. But obviously, day-to-day fighting is being done by people who were volunteers from Russia and people who are from those regions themselves.
Can I there's one tiny thing, if you could just add to, and it's obviously significant, is a question here about coal exports from Donbas. What channels does it actually go through? Because, of course, this is part of the economic functioning of the area.
Yeah, that's very important.
Very.
That's very important. There are several Russian industrial groups which are working with coal exports. Main people who are doing this, they are from Kemerovo region, from Kuzbas, and also former Ukrainian team, Yanukovych's team, is also very much involved in all the energy trades, there. Originally, the guy who was doing this was Suleiman Kerimov and his partner Oleg Mukarchan. They were partners in Metinvest group, Ukrainian group, and after the war started, they, being on Russian territory, they tried to carry on, and they were carrying on both trade in coal and in metals. From metallurgical plants that are on the territory that are controlled by separatists. There is also another line of trade which goes in the hands of Rinat Akhmetov in Ukraine. As far as I know, it's been done via sea, but I would not exclude that there are also some holes in the border where the coal can siphon to Ukraine as well. Anyway, that how this whole formula Rotterdam Plus was constructed when Akhmetov was buying coal actually from eastern Ukraine at a very cheap discounted price, and then pretended like it was imported from Rotterdam and made a lot of profits, which was split between Poroshenko's economic team and Akhmetov himself. That was one of the major sources of funding for President Poroshenko's electoral campaign.
Ilya, there's one question I think is interesting, because in my conversations with Russians, they have a sort of, at least you talk very interestingly about your own constituents in the context of the invasion of Crimea. But there's definitely an emotional aspect amongst some Russians, at least, because I've spoken to them, about Ukraine. In other words, that Ukraine is not, and we've had this interesting question from Stepan, who's actually a member of the National Executive Ukrainian Youth Association in the UK. So there's an historical narrative. We saw all the dramas about the separation of the Orthodox Church, for example. So do people feel that there is this sort of emotional link to Kiev historically, to Ukraine? And do you think that this is actually still a potent force emotionally in the hearts of some Russians?
Oh, look, I think there is virtually no Russian which would not have certain Ukrainian roots. Yeah. In general, what is Russia? Russia is a mix between Ukraine and Tatar, and some Nordic nations. That's what Russia is. The cradle of our civilization was in Kiev. It's Kievan Rus. The birthplace of our church was there. Our culture is from there. Our government, our statehood is from there. So what is Russia without Ukraine? It's like very unclear what it is. And of course, there are a lot of relatives. When I have done my genetic research on 23andMe, what I saw, half of myself as Ukrainian roots and half Nordic roots. Probably it's like from those varyags which were coming to Russia to bring statehood in the past. So that's what we are. So of course, for Russians, it's a very touchy question. Russians do not understand why Ukrainians are so hostile. They don't recognize that we have actually waged the war against the country, and propaganda is trying to avoid this as much as possible. That's a big problem, to tell them the truth. And even when you are asking people in the popular polls, what do they think about military engagement in eastern Ukraine, the overwhelming majority of Russians say no. Crimea, yes, majority of Russians say Crimea is ours, although the numbers are going down during last years. They are significantly lower than they were in the moment of annexation, but still, you know, the majority of people say that it's ours because it was part of Russia for many years. There is a lot of military glory. It's a question of Sebastopol there. Actually, I think that one of the potential compromises in the future can be that like Sebastopol stays with Russia and the rest of Crimea is returned to Ukraine. That's, I don't want again to be provocative here. I'm just saying that there are certain things which can be negotiated when Crimea would be going back to Ukraine. But yeah, Crimea, it's one question. The rest of Ukraine is totally different, and I think that actually Ukraine is heavily underutilizing this sentiment, because the narrative in Ukraine has been dominated by Ukrainian nationalists. We usually have like Western Ukrainian origin, and they tend to say, okay, so like let's forget about Russia, let's separate from Russia. We don't know Russia, we hate Russia, that's like our genuine enemy and whatever. And that's not how the majority of even Ukrainians think. So I think that Ukrainian has to pretend to the role of regional leader of post-Soviet space and of Slavic nations, and Kiev has all the rights to compete for this and to actually win this. And that goes beyond Russia, that goes also for Belarus as well. Again, Kiev is the center of this civilization, and Kiev is the center of cultural heritage, and Kiev has a lot to offer if he would recognize this heritage that it actually has.
Just one thing, of course, we are seeing some political parties that have grown up in Europe, for example, Fidesz, AfD, which do from time to time express some sort of support or sympathy for Russia. Does this play anything, have any role as far as leverage for Russia is concerned, or is it just considered to be useful but eccentric and has no real power? I mean, how do you see that?
No, of course, this is something that is being utilized, no doubt, you know, and that's what Russian PR is very professional at, is to play those cards. And when some of Western politicians are doing this, or whether it's just, you know, cultural, people of cultural importance and recognition, are saying something like this. Actually, Russia was in the last 20 years very bad at soft power. It was totally disintegrated after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The previous soft power was based on the leftist ideas and the communist values and whatever. So it totally disappeared. But Putin firstly started to organize old nobility, old white and cultural immigration from Soviet Union around himself, and managed to reintegrate Russian Orthodox Church in exile with the mainland Russian Orthodox Church, also creating a lot of leverage for himself. And then he started to use this nobility with especially dedicated political technologies to actually draw more Western politicians in those circles. And originally it was more like money friends, based on the potential contracts that he can give and donations that can go in the political parties in the West. But recently it's a lot of, as I mentioned before, a lot of real public pressure because of the severed economic ties and loss of revenues that was coming from the trade with Russia. And at the same time, he's doing exactly the same within Ukraine. Because obviously in Ukraine still, you know, in this situation of war, according to popular polls, you would see from 15 to 20% of population actually still thinks that Putin is a great leader and that Ukraine has to be with Russia. That's more or less the number. You know, before the war has started, it was like 60%. And that's why I'm saying that Putin has done a huge geopolitical mistake. He totally alienated the country which was the most friendly to us, our key ally. But still, the number of people who think the same way is pretty significant. And of course, this card is being played all the time.
We're going to have one more question. In the meantime, a poll will be made available to those who've been listening in and participating about this particular webinar. But, you know, when President Zelensky won with this huge support from the population, there was definitely a subtext that he wanted to do business with Russia, not as directly as that, but you know exactly what I mean. And do you think, and you were talking about possible outlines of what he might be able to offer and suggest as a basis for negotiation to clear up the situation in the eastern part of the country. But what is your observation of his current political capital in respect of this?
Oh, of course, for Mr. Zelensky, to be able to negotiate a peace is crucial for his popular support. This is his mission with which he came to power. And I think that Zelensky would do everything possible to make a peace deal. And I see him trying. It's just that, unfortunately, what we see, firstly, that really there is a certain lack of experience, political experience. He is not that weak, this guy, Mr. Zelensky. He is a pretty strong character, actually. It's no surprise that he was performing Napoleon at one point of time in one movie. That's very much his character. He is a very strict leader, and he's a talented manager. But at the same time, he is novice in terms of politics, and this is visible. He sometimes tends to make two short-term decisions, like the one that he has done with removing the previous government at the beginning of March, which to my mind was a grave mistake. But at the same time, he immediately decided to compensate this mistake by inviting former President Saakashvili to his team. And that can partially compensate for the removing of the previous government, but it's not clear right now whether Saakashvili would be voted for this job in Rada, and so far it looks like he won't. And that actually shows the fundamental weakness for Zelensky. Still, again, Ukrainian elites are very much dependent on this patriotic minority, and I'm also patriotic, and they are patriotic. It's just that those people who are tough liners, who are very very hawkish on the potential peace deal, and to get something through Verkhovная Rada is a difficult exercise at the moment. Zelensky is trying to get around this, and that's why he's talking about elections on those territories, which again, if I would be him, I would not do elections on this territory for another 5 years at least. We remember the example of, say, Western Germany after World War II, when those guys didn't have election for how many, like 6 years after the World War, and it was not a violation of democracy, it's just because it's impossible to have proper elections in the destroyed country, which is in the state of war, and a lot of displaced people, and a lot of sentiment which does not allow people to judge objectively and reasonably when they go into ballots. So Zelensky wants to have those elections. But at the end of the day, he is sending all the time one simple message, that we all are Ukrainians, and Ukrainians can be different. There can be Ukrainians who like Marshal Zhukov of the Soviet Union, and there are Ukrainians who like Bandera of UPA. There are Ukrainians who are communists, and there are Ukrainians who are conservatives. But it's one nation, very diverse, but nevertheless we should stay united. And that's his approach towards Donbas. And those words, actually, I think they are the right words. If he would be allowed to push them through political mechanisms, I think that he would be very successful.
Well, thank you. I'm going to thank you properly, but we've just been conducting a bit of a poll, and that should hopefully come on the screen. Just about. Here come the poll.
Interesting results.
I'm just seeing. I don't know what
audience is exactly split.
The audience is split. Oh, all right. Well, there you are.
So I haven't done my job properly, because I was trying to convince that it's possible.
Look, I'm going to just say to you that this has been absolutely outstanding. It's the first time we've done anything like this, and I think that you are an amazing communicator, and you've given us a wonderfully broad coverage of all the aspects, because you bring your own unique experience as a former Russian member of parliament. You understand Russia, you understand Ukraine, you want to see the two countries coexisting properly and effectively together. And I think you've explained this better than just about anything I've ever heard on this subject. And what I'm going to do now is what we're all doing in England when we want to thank people very especially, because of course with this dreadful virus, we clap. So I want everybody to clap now, because I am clapping.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Because, we look forward to your visit to London one day soon.
Thank you very much, and stay safe in these troubled times. And I wish everybody to end this quarantine as soon as possible, so that we can make our meeting together either in London or in Kiev or in any other location that would be comfortable for everyone.
Well, I think you will now have a queue of a fan club wanting to see you wherever it is going to be, whether it's Kiev or London. But thank you most profoundly. It's been absolutely terrific.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.